First men. The first men are the original human inhabitants of Westeros. They ruled the continent for thousands of years before the Andals invaded from the eastern continent of Essos. The Andals overran most of southern Westeros, but failed to take the north. While the blood of the first men and the Andals has heavily intermingled over the centuries, through marriage or otherwise, the inhabitants of the north have the greatest amount of first men blood in their veins and still maintain many of their traditions. First men noble houses typically have short descriptive names, for example, Flint, Gardner, Marsh, Mud, Reed, Stark, or Strong. The first men are one of the three major ethnic groups from which the humans of Westeros descend, the others being the Andals and the Rhoynar. The first men were the culture of humans who first set foot on the continent. The influence of the first men is still felt in Westeros, most strongly in the north. The Lord of the Seven Kingdoms, the king on the Iron Throne, claims to be the king of the Andals, the Rhoynar, and the first men. Language. The original language of the first men was the Old Tongue, a harsh, clanging language that is still spoken by the free folk and the giants north of the Wall. The first men had a runic writing system. First men left their runes on rocks in most of the Seven Kingdoms. Only in the Stormlands, where races older than the first men were dominant, did the first men carve their tails into the trunks of trees, which have since rotted away. The meaning of the runes of the first men are disputed at the Citadel to this day. Religion. The first men worshipped unspecified gods before they arrived in Westeros. The sister men of the Three Sisters believed that sacred storms were the result of the Lady of the Waves mating with the Lord of the Skies. Their worship ended with the coming of the Andals, who introduced the faith of the Seven. In the Kingdom of the Storm, the sea god and his wife, the goddess of the wind, were worshipped. The Ironborn, who are considered by most to descend from the first men, worshipped the drowned god before the Andals came and continue to do so. In addition, they also continue to believe in the drowned god's eternal enemy, the storm god. Following the pact between the first men and the children of the forest, the majority of the first men eventually set aside their own gods and adopted the gods of the children as their own. These nameless deities of stream, forest, and stone are referred to as the old gods because the gods of the Andals, referred to as the new gods, replaced them in all but the north of Westeros. The worship of the old gods is not accompanied by priests, holy texts, songs of worship, and barely any rites. Prayers are done in silence. Worshippers of the old gods visit godswoods, groves contained within castles throughout the Seven Kingdoms, where a heart tree can be found. These trees, which have faces carved into them, are considered to be sacred. Worshippers believe the old gods watch through the trees. The heart trees are usually weirwoods, and godswoods are often the only places where living weirwoods still remain until one goes north of the Wall. Once all noble houses had a godswood with a heart tree in its center, but the first men, in their wars against the children of the forest, cut down many of the trees, as did the Andals later on, replacing the old gods with the seven in the southern kingdoms. According to Maester Yorick, blood sacrifice to the old gods was still practiced in the vicinity of White Harbor 500 years ago. Social hierarchy. The exact laws of inheritance followed by the first men have not been stated. Several of the groups that descended from the first men practiced rule by consensus or election among several lords and chieftains in council. The Ironborn of old chose their kings through a kingsmoot, where each man who owned and captained a ship might cast a vote for the new king. In Dorne, before the coming of the Andals or the Rhoynar, the first men were divided into numerous petty kingdoms. The High Kings of Dorne, who ruled the lands near the mouth of the Greenblood, were elected in a non-hereditary fashion from among a dozen noble families. This practice eventually collapsed when a dispute concerning an election set the families to war against one another. The free folk who live beyond the Wall are led by chieftains. At several times during history, they have united behind a non-hereditary overchief known as the King Beyond the Wall. The Vale Mountain clans are led by chieftains as well. In council, they insist that every man or woman must be allowed to have their voice heard. According to Archmaester Aaron, the ancient Marsh kings of the Crannogmen of the Neck were considered to be a first among equals, often thought to be touched by the old gods. Thraldom was a common practice amongst the first men before the arrival of the Andals. The first night was a custom in which warlords and heroes slept with maidens on their wedding night. Pregnancies were seen by some as a blessing, as the new husbands could then raise the children of heroes as their own. Military. The first men wielded bronze swords and great bronze axes. They were armored in bronze as well, carrying large, leather shields. When the coming of the Andals began, the first men still fought in bronze. In time, however, Andal blacksmiths taught the first men to arm and armor themselves in iron. The first men rode horses into battle. Although not a seafaring people, the first men did use fishing boats and trading cogs, though these were no match for longships with great sails and banks of oars. Architecture and infrastructure. When the first men first settled in Westeros, they cut down the forests, began to plow the fields, and constructed roads through the hill country. The farms and villages the first men built were protected by stout mud and bailey forts, which were later on replaced by stone castles. The first men also raised up ring forts, ruins of which can still be found at numerous places, including the Fist of the First Men, and Seal Rock at White Harbor, and the Stormlands. On Sea Dragon Point still stand ruins of ancient strongholds of the first men. The first men, and later on the early Andals, built square towers and keeps. In the Reach, Andal stonemasons taught the first men how to further strengthen the defenses of their castles and holdfasts. Some of the barrow fields contain monuments. Guest right. The custom of guest right is both a sacred rule and an ancient one. The guest rights are taken seriously, both beyond the wall and in the Seven Kingdoms, and although it looms less in the Southron Kingdoms, it is held most dear in the north. There, breaking guest right is punished similarly to the direst of treasons. The most common way of receiving guest right is by eating bread and salt. Once guest right has been offered and accepted, the guests and hosts are protected from harm by one another for the length of the stay. Guest gifts can be given on the day the guests depart, possibly as a means of ending the protection of the guest right. Guest gifts are no longer given by all lords, however. Death. The first men believed that the person who condemned another to die should be the one who wields the sword. House Stark practices this belief still. The first men interred their dead in barrows, which can be found everywhere in the north, example, the Great Barrow of Barrow Tun, where the first king of the first men is said to have been buried. The Bar Rollins contains wide plains of flatness, which are relieved by long, low hummocks, the barrows of the first men. The Starks bury their deceased family members in the crypts of Winterfell, located beneath the castle. The Boltons similarly bury their deceased beneath the Dread Fort. The Blackwoods, originally from the north, bury their dead beneath the Weirwood of Raventree. The Tullis of Riverrun, a house of first men origin who now follow the faith of the Seven, place their dead in a ship on the Red Fork and have it sink into the river after being set ablaze with fire arrows. Arrival in Westeros, the Pact, and the Age of Heroes. Some maesters believe that the first man originated in the grasslands of Essos, in the lands now known as the Dothraki Sea. Between 8,000 and 12,000 years before Aegon's landing, during the Dawn Age, the first men came to Westeros from Essos, although no tale recalls exactly why they made the trek westwards. The first men crossed the land bridge called the Arm of Dorne under the leadership of the first king, according to legends from the north, or Garth Greenhand, the High King of the first men, according to some legends from the Reach. The first men supposedly found the Seastone chair upon the shores of Old Wyke when they first came to the Iron Islands. It was the first men who named the indigenous inhabitants Children of the Forest, though the diminutive people's own name for themselves translates as those who sing the song of the earth. The first men invaded Westeros some 12,000 years before the events of the series, crossing via a land bridge that connected Essos to the vicinity of modern-day Dorne. The first men came with bronze swords and great leathern shields, riding horses. As the men settled in the new land, carving out holdfasts and farms, they chopped down and burned the carved weirwoods that were sacred to the gods of the Children of the Forest. This provoked wars between the children and the first men. Though the children fought with their greenseers, magic, and wood dancers, the first men were larger, stronger, and more technologically advanced. The first men cut down weirwoods as they believed that the greenseers could see through the eyes of the trees. According to the old songs, the desperate children gathered greenseers to the Isle of Faces or to Moat Cailin, a castle raised roughly 10,000 years ago by the first men. The greenseers used dark magic to shatter the Arm of Dorne with the Hammer of the Waters, creating the stepstones and the broken arm and flooding the neck into a swamp. Although the land bridge from Essos was shattered, the greenseers failed in their effort to halt the first men, who were already more numerous in Westeros. First men also warred against giants, who were hostile to the newcomers. They were resisted by the Children of the Forest, a magical, diminutive race who ruled Westeros along with the giants. The children, using magic, destroyed the land bridge, forming the modern peninsula of Dorne and the shattered islands known as the Stepstones beyond, but were pushed back over the course of many years of warfare. Eventually, the first men and the children forged the pact, signed on the Isle of Faces at the center of the vast lake known as God's Eye. The first men began to forge numerous kingdoms across the continent. The wars against the Children of the Forest went in the first men's favor until the two sides reached a peace agreement, called the Pact, on the Isle of Faces. The first men gave dominion of the deep woods to the children and promised to stop cutting down weirwoods. In return, they received claim to the rest of the Westeros. Giants did not participate in the pact. The pact began 4,000 years of friendship and peace between the two peoples, although the children were already much diminished. The years that followed the forging of the pact is known as the Age of Heroes. The first men eventually set aside their religion to worship the children's secret gods of the wood, and like the children they carved faces into the weirwoods, creating heart trees. The children of the forest taught them to use ravens to communicate over long distances, but in those days the birds would speak the words, and the greenseers of the children could change their skins and speak through the animals. The two races subsequently coexisted peacefully for millennia, and during this time the first men converted to the religion of the children, worshipping the old gods of the forest. The old gods are nameless and uncountable spirits of nature, and their worship centers around sacred heart trees, weirwood trees which have had faces carved into their bark by the children of the forest. The fortresses and strongholds of the first men in Westeros soon began to feature gods' woods, sacred garden groves of weirwoods centered around heart trees. About 8,000 years ago, both races came under attack from the White Walkers, a mysterious race of ice and cold from the uttermost north. In the War for the Dawn, the first men and the children unified to throw back the invasion. With the aid of giants and the children, Bran the Builder built the wall and would then build Winterfell and rule as the first king in the north. The first men subsequently founded the Night's Watch to guard the wall should the White Walkers ever return. After this war the children began dwindling in numbers, with the last of them disappearing around the time that the Andals invaded Westeros, 2 millennia after the War for the Dawn according to tradition. During the Long Night, the first men suffered from a generation of winter and the legendary others are said to have invaded from the land of always winter. Archmaester Fomas suggests the others were a tribe of first men instead of a monstrous enemy. Northern legends claim the last hero sought out the children of the forest to gain their aid. The others were driven back in the battle for the dawn and the Night's Watch was created to keep them at bay. 6,000 or 8,000 years ago the first men built the wall, allegedly with the aid of children and giants. The Undal invasion of Westeros. Thousands of years after the Long Night, the Undals crossed the Narrow Sea and began their migration from Essos to Westeros. For several hundred years the first men and the Undals warred, fighting for control of the continent. Eventually, the Undals conquered or married into the kingdoms in the southern half of the continent, while the first men kings of winter stopped all Undal incursions through the neck at Moat Cailin. The Undals continued practice of the First Night. 6,000 years ago, the Undals sailed across the Narrow Sea and began a massive migration to Westeros. First landing in the Vale, the Andals spread across the continent in waves for the next 1,000 or so years, until they had overrun and conquered almost all of the continent. Their attempts to conquer the north, however, were defeated at every turn, in part because the narrow lands of the neck which separate the north from the rest of the continent are an ideal strategic choke point, defended by the ancient castle of Moat Cailin. After many centuries the Undals and First Men made peace, as individual Undal kingdoms carved out of southern Westeros became more concerned with fighting each other than uniting to crush the remaining independent First Men of the north. The results of the Undal invasion varied from region to region. In the Vale of Arryn, the First Men were all but wiped out, and today the nobility of the Vale are considered to have the purest Undal bloodlines in all of Westeros. In many other regions, the Undals established themselves as the new aristocratic class ruling over the First Men, though after thousands of years these ethnic lines have blurred to a large extent. Some of the noble houses of the First Men survived by intermarrying with Undal invaders, even House Lannister possesses some First Men blood, through the female line. The Undals that invaded the Westerlands married the female descendants of Lon the Clever, a legendary hero of the First Men, and House Lannister descends from this union. In the Riverlands, House Blackwood and House Bracken are also dynasties of First Men that survived by intermarrying with the Undal invaders, and today are of mixed ethnicity. The descendants of the First Men. Many people living in Westeros have at least some blood of the First Men in their ethnic makeup, though this is more common in the lower classes. Even so, the southern kingdoms of Westeros became so thoroughly dominated by the Undals and their culture, that Westeros is often referred to as the land of the Undals and Essos. Two groups in Westeros, however, still claim majority descent from the First Men, and still actively embrace the old ways and religion of their ancestors, the Northmen and the Wildlings. The Crannogmen of the Neck are themselves a unique offshoot of the Northerners, while the hill tribes of the Vale are an isolate of First Men ancestry. Ties of dynastic marriage were made between the North and the Southern kingdoms over the next 6,000 years, so that the blood of both peoples mingled together, a process that has continued under the rule of the Targaryen kings. For example, Ned Stark, of the ruling dynasty of the First Men of the North, married Catelyn Tully, of the predominantly Undal ruling dynasty of the Riverlands, resulting in all of their children having mixed blood. Still, while the kingdoms south of the Neck consist of heavily mixed Undal and First Men ethnicity, the North is still predominantly First Men. The Wildlings that live north of the Wall are descended from those First Men who were living north of the Wall when it was constructed, and have an even purer bloodline than the North. There is little, if any, Undal blood north of the Wall. Even in the Stark-held North, the usage of the language of the first men, the Old Tongue, was eventually discontinued in favor of adopting the language of their Andal neighbors to the south. However, the language of the first men is still actively used north of the Wall, notably by the Thens, though a large number of wildlings are also fluent in the common tongue of the Andals. Legacy. According to George R.R. Martin, hardly any Westerosi are pure Andal or first man after thousands of years of interbreeding. While much of their culture was lost over the millennia, the people of the north retained the spirit of the first men, and many are proud of carrying the blood of the first men in their veins, such as the Starks and the Karstarks. South of the Neck there have been people that still proudly claim the blood of the first men, such as the Blackwoods and Brackens, the Danes, the Red Forts, the Royces, the Strongs, the Westerlings, and the people of Cracklaw Point. Lord Yon Royce possesses a suit of bronze, rune-covered armor dating back thousands of years. The Vale Mountain clans of the Mountains of the Moon are descendants of the first men. During Aegon's conquest, Aegon I Targaryen was proclaimed king of the Andals, the Rhoynar, and the first man by the High Septon in Oldtown, and Aegon's successors on the Iron Throne have continued the usage. Since the Seven Kingdoms continued to have inconsistent laws by the time of King Jaehaerys I Targaryen, including some places following ancient laws of the first men, Septon Barth began the unifying Great Code in 55 AC. Barth and Queen Alysanne Targaryen ended the practice of the first night, considering it an antiquated practice of the first men of old. Beyond the Wall, the Thens consider themselves the last of the first men. In the books. In the A Song of Ice and Fire novels, the first men living in the north were able to resist the Andal invasion due to the geographical choke point of the neck, which separates the north from the rest of the continent. The powerful fortress of Moat Cailin commands the approach to the north through the swamps of the neck. The only major road that large armies can use to travel north through the neck is so well defended by Moat Cailin that the kings of winter were able to consistently repulse Andal attempts to invade their lands. To be clear, the first men are not the first humans who lived in the entire world. Humans were already living on the eastern continent of Essos for untold millennia, and probably also on Sithorios, the Africa-like continent south of Essos. The exact origins of the human race are not known, because just as in real life, written history does not extend that far back. Even oral history eventually fades into varying fables, legends, and religious explanations for the origins of humans. The first men are simply the first humans that migrated to the western continent of Westeros. Author George R.R. Martin has stated that the series was loosely inspired by the War of the Roses, which occurred in Britain during the 15th century. The first men loosely parallel the original Celtic inhabitants of Britain, while the Andals who later invaded and conquered Westeros are loosely parallel to the Anglo-Saxon invasions of Britain during the 5th and 6th centuries. The Anglo-Saxons never conquered the Celtic peoples living in the region that would become modern Scotland, in the north of the island of Britain, who remained ethnically and culturally distinct. Similarly, the Stark-held north resisted the invasion of the Andals from the south, and like Scotland remained ethnically and culturally distinct. Both Scotland and the north benefited from being separated from the rest of the island by a narrow isthmus. Wales also wasn't immediately conquered by the Anglo-Saxons, but in its case this was due to mountainous terrain in Westeros. Dorne is a closer analogue to real-life Wales than the north is, though crossed with medieval Spain. The Anglo-Saxons did intermingle on some level with the Celtic/Romano-British inhabitants of what would become modern England, but they were subjugated and largely subsumed by the Anglo-Saxons. Similarly, people in the southern kingdoms of Westeros have some partial descent from the first men, in regions where the Andals conquered and intermingled with the first men instead of wiping them out entirely.
If you like this content, don't forget to like and subscribe. See you later, bye bye.